Contract administration, which is actually a third module in level 3, that is L3M3, is not even as difficult as most students tend to think it is, right? We just see contracts and then you assume it's difficult. No, it isn't, okay? In fact, most things in contracts just come down to language and whether or not you understand the logic behind the agreement that the parties in that contract had. Now, this being a revision series, and just to prove how not so complicated these things are, we're going to look at the first assessment criteria in module 1. That is, we're going to look at questions and answers relating to spot purchase, term contracts, framework agreements or blanket orders and panel agreements, and call-offs. Because that, as I said, is the first assessment criteria, okay, in learning outcome 1. And the idea here is to put you in a position to identify types of contract and agreements. Now, it's a quick one, okay? If you're not part of our newsletter, the Zerite Talk newsletter, make sure you join, because here's what happens. Every week, do send out summary notes, PDF, downloads, practice exercise, all that stuff, right? So every week you get educational content depending on which area of your study. So if it is level 3, you can pick which, if it is 2, if it is 4, if it is 5. The point is you get all that content. So make sure you join the newsletter. Link is added in the description. Now let's continue. As I said, in this revision series, our focus is for you to be able to identify types of contracts and agreements. And again, that is, the first learning outcome, assessment criteria 1 in learning outcome 1. So then the question is, what exactly is learning outcome 1? And the first learning outcome in your L3M3 is, or rather requires you to know the administrative content and key tasks associated with commercial contracts. Now, before we jump into the questions, there are a few things you need to understand here, okay? What exactly do you understand by words like contracts, agreements, and essentials for a valid contract? For starters, when we talk about a contract, we're talking about an agreement that is legally binding. That is something you need to know before you even bother going into the questions. So a contract is a legally binding agreement. And that is important because that separates contract from other social agreements. Like when your friend says, are we going to meet for drinks? Like, no, or yes, and then you don't show up. They're not going to take you to court for that, right? Rather, it's not legally binding. So a contract is a legally binding agreement. And the other thing you need to understand is how that contract differs from day-to-day agreements, which is important because you can automatically assume that, well, we said it's a legally binding agreement and therefore it's commercial. What about social agreements? Some social agreements can also end up becoming a contract. For instance, think about it, right? So if a man and a woman, married, husband, wife, and then they get a house through mortgage, and then they separate, like things don't work out, and then the lady says, look, I'm going to finish this mortgage, okay? I'm going to finish that, but then the entire house transfers to me. And then the guy says, yeah, cool. So you see, that sort of agreement is not the same as a situation where the man says, I'm going to be working in the next city for the next 2 days, and I'll send you some money to, buy food or something. And then they go there, and then they forget to send the money. Well, marriage. So anyway, they go there, they forget to send the money. So in that case, can the wife go to court and say, this guy went there and then he didn't send money, and therefore I'm suing him because he owes me money? So there's a difference, right? And they are both social agreements, but one of them is legally binding. So in addition to knowing what a contract is and how it differs from day-to-day contracts or other agreements, you also have to know what makes for a valid contract. That is essentials of a valid contract. Notice, we've not even started revising. We're just talking about what you need to know as far as contracts are concerned. So what makes for a valid contract? In this case, there has to be an offer, okay, which is willingness to get into a contract on definite terms if those terms are accepted. So you always start with making an offer. Someone else has to accept that offer, okay? There are rules regarding acceptance. So, but the idea is acceptance can be expressed where you specifically say, I agree to this thing, or acceptance can be implied, right? Where we look at your behavior and decide if there was acceptance or not. Anyway, Then there is consideration. That is the price of getting into that contract, because the entire thing about contracts is that they are based on the principle of quid pro quo. That is something for something. You buy an item, okay? So if you buy whatever item, okay, so that's what you get. But then what does the seller get? So while you get this, the seller gets money, price, right? So something for something. And then the contract has to be capable of performance. The both parties must intend for legal consequences to follow. I mean, those are the thing. Like there are a bunch of stuff that will make for a valid contract. All those are things that you need to understand, because at some point they are going to be part of the questions that you need to find answers to. Right, and so to test all that, let's look at questions that are going to test whether you understand, contracts, agreements, and elements of a valid contract. Now in this case, what do you have? The first one, which of the following shows the distinction between a contract and a simple agreement? Now, first of all agreements are legally binding. Well, not really. A contract must have mutual consent, while an agreement doesn't have to. Contracts are enforceable by law, while agreements may not be. Agreements require consideration, but contracts do not. Well, first of all, contracts require considerations. We've just talked about that one. All agreements are not legally binding, okay? A contract must have even agreements sometimes do require mutual consent. The issue is contracts are enforceable by law, while agreements may not, because you've just said some agreements of a social nature may not be enforceable or are not enforced by law. Next, which of the following is an example of an agreement that is not a contract? So you're just saying, look, it's an agreement, but is it a contract? Well, a written promise to pay for goods received. That's a contract, okay? An invitation to dinner between friends. Well, we don't even need to go any further. A signed lease for property, a formal purchase. The answer is B. Okay, so an invitation to dinner between friends is just a social thing, which is not a contract. What is the legal term for an agreement that is enforced by law? And so now we're just asking you, do you know what a contract is? Because a contract is a legal term, okay, or a legal agreement, rather, that is enforceable by law. So the answer is contract, okay? Which of the following is not an essential element of a valid contract? Well, there has to be an offer, there has to be acceptance, there has to be consideration, there has to be an intention to create a legal relation. Now, the answer is D. Why? Because performance of an obligation is not an essential of a valid contract. But, okay, and this is why you need to be careful, right? But a contract must be capable of performance. Otherwise, it just becomes a void contract. Like if you contract to do something that is not capable of performance, like you contract to sell the moon. I mean, yes, you have an offer, then you have a moron who accepted that offer, and they're willing to pay you, but then what exactly, you can't give what you don't have. It sort of falls under the rules of something called NEMODAT, okay, code non-habet, which simply means you can't give a better title than the one that you have, or you basically can't sell what you don't own or something. I mean, there are exceptions to this rule, but for now, that's the basic rule. There are scenarios where you can give what you don't have. But anyway, that's the thing, okay? Performance of an obligation comes after a contract has already been put in place, okay? You provide consideration, you expect them to do something on their part. Otherwise, it becomes a breach of a contract. So that is not an essential. That is something that comes later. What does legality of purpose in a contract mean? Well, does it mean that the contract must be written in legal language? No. The contract must be for a lawful objective. What do you think? The contract must not involve minors. Well, in that case, it's just going to be a contract that is voidable. Okay? At the option of the minor. Contract must be notarized? Not really. The answer is the contract must be of a lawful objective. Otherwise, that is legality, okay? Intention for legal purpose to follow, because whatever you're doing is legal. Otherwise, you just have a contract, but it becomes an illegal contract. So these things are easy, man. Anyway, which of these is not a type of consideration? Remember we said consideration is pretty much the price you pay, okay? for you to get into a contract. So which of these is not that? A promise to perform a service. Yeah, well, they will perform and then you'll pay me, right? So that is just, delivery of goods. That's consideration. You've already delivered. Money paid in advance. Well, that's payment. So it's consideration. A legal obligation imposed by, no, that's not consideration. Because if the court imposes something, okay, if the court imposes an obligation on you, as far as that contract is concerned, see, that is not consideration. And courts can impose, like for example, if you fail to perform your part of the contract, and then the court says you have to do it. You see, that is a remedy. It becomes a specific performance. If they want you to do something, or they want you to pay something, then it depends. Is it liquidated or illiquidated damages? See, those are remedies. Those are not, as the question asked you. So that is not consideration. So see, those are just simple questions that are testing whether you understand what a contract is, whether you understand what an agreement is, and whether you understand how contract differs from an agreement, as well as essentials for valid contract. See, we are still, it's revision, right? So now let's jump into questions that relate to the other part of your 3M3 syllabus. Let's move on. Now let's talk about our, the first type of commercial agreement. Remember, the whole idea is identifying types of commercial agreements. So the first one in this case is going to be spot purchase, okay? Or spot purchase contracts, if you think of it from that perspective. Spot purchasing refers to buying goods or services to meet an immediate need rather than to hold in stock for future use. So the idea is that, you are in procurement, or, you're doing a business and then you run out of something. And now what are you going to do? You're not going to sit there, start identifying suppliers, going through all those. You just say, look, go buy that thing. So you see, now that sort of becomes the spot purchase sort of contract because you've just bought it. And it's not really that complicated because these contracts don't have to be written and stuff. I mean, they can, but sometimes it's just as easy as walking into a shop and buying something. Okay? That's how simple that is. And obviously, that sort of deal has advantages and disadvantages. Remember, spot purchase accounts for 40% of indirect spend, and so they need to be controlled. What exactly do you mean by indirect spend in this case? It's revision, so you just can't say things and then they're not clear. What do you understand by that? What do you understand by indirect spend? So with indirect spend, we're talking about, this is spending on things that are not directly incurred in the manufacture of a product or delivery of a service. For example, insurance, right? So if you are producing these pens, so the insurance of your staff, right? Like employees, whatever, that is not going to be directly attributed to, that cost isn't going to be directly attributed to the cost of making this pen. We have plastics and ink and whatever that is. So, but not insurance. Anyway, let's jump into the questions that relate to this particular part, okay? Spot purchase contracts. And so in this case, we're talking about questions testing your knowledge on definition of spot purchase contracts and pretty much their use, right? So number one, what is a spot purchase contract? First of all, is it a long-term agreement for purchasing goods over time? Spot, so a one-time agreement for an immediate purchase of goods. A framework agreement with multiple suppliers, that is just a framework agreement with multiple suppliers, is just a panel agreement. So anyway, a contract for leasing, no, it's a one-time agreement, okay, for an immediate, or rather an immediate purchase of goods or services rather. Number two, which of the following is a primary characteristics? Okay, which of the following is a primary characteristic of a spot purchase contract? It's a flexible, okay? It is flexible and allows for repeated purchases. Is that it? It involves a fixed price for a specified period. It is executed immediately after agreement. It requires detailed legal documentation. Well, it is executed immediately after the agreement because you buy something and, well, that's it. The contract is done at that point, right? They deliver, you're done. Which of the following is an example of a spot purchase? Good, buying. So now we're talking about examples, right? I mean, we've defined it. So in this case, buying printer ink for a last minute presentation, leasing an office space for a year. See, that's long term, right? Signing a supplier framework agreement. That's a framework agreement. Hiring cleaning service on monthly. That is not spot. So it's this one, the one off, right? Buying printer ink for last minute presentation. Manufacturing company experiences an unexpected machine breakdown and orders a specific part for immediate delivery. Now, what is an example of that? Or rather, this is an example of service level agreement, right? Nope. Long-term contract, because they are no, look, it is a spot purchase contract. That's pretty much, so, that's an example as far as that is concerned. So, is a question testing you, can you spot? This one was like, do you know an example of that? And this is, you are giving you a scenario and then you're saying, can you pick out what that is? What documentation is typically required for a spot purchase contract? Detailed performance reports, simple invoice and purchase order, comprehensive supply chain agreement, long-term, anything long-term is not important. It's just a simple invoice and purchase order. It's just, we want to buy this thing and this is how much you guys owe us, okay, or how much we owe you. So, spot purchase contracts are most commonly used by which type of organization? Now, manufacturers with stable production needs, retailers facing unpredictable consumer demands, logistic providers planning long-term. In fact, anytime you see long-term, just forget about it, okay? Construction firm building mega projects. They're not going to buying things on the spot. It's these guys, retailers facing unpredictable consumer demands, because today you think they want this thing, so you stock that thing, tomorrow they want this one. So it means you're just going to be buying things based on whatever it is that these what are they called? These customers of yours want. So those are just questions testing whether you understand what a spot purchase is and which, their use, right? Now, as you continue, remember, if you have a question, you ask. So let's move on to the next one. In this case, we're talking about the benefits of, spot purchase contracts. So look, these contracts will have advantages and disadvantages, and you need to understand these advantages in terms of what are the advantages to the buyer and what are the advantages to the seller. And some of the questions will revolve around that. So these questions could look something like this. So for starters, we're looking at a benefit of spot purchase contract to both the buyer and the supplier, or the supplier and the buyer. Why are spot purchase contracts beneficial from a supplier's perspective? So we just want to know, why is the supplier happy with it? Because A, they establish long-term contract, they establish long-term customer loyalty. They are spot, so there's nothing long-term, right? They allow suppliers to clear excess stock quickly. They involve fixed pricing over an extended period. There is nothing extended about these things, and they don't even help in reducing competition. So they just help the supplier to quickly clear their stock, because you're just buying what you need when you need it at that particular moment. How do spot purchase contracts benefit buyers financially if the buyer is in an urgent situation? Simple. Because it allows them to get discounts. Okay? No. By ensuring price stability. Oh, really? By enabling deferred. Not really. It's just they eliminate, okay, long-term commitments, because it's spot, right? So you're not really signing up for something that is going to be long-term. Next. How can suppliers benefit from selling goods through spot purchase contracts? By leveraging immediate cash flow from one-time sales. And that is the reason why, that's pretty much it. So there's nothing predictable, because you never really knew if somebody was going to buy. They don't reduce supply chain risks, okay? They don't even stabilize long-term demand. It's just that somebody's buying that thing now, and you can take advantage of that need and charge a high price, especially if you know that they're desperately in need of that thing. So the supplier can leverage immediate cash flow from that one-time purchase, depending on whatever it is that is being purchased. So how can spot purchase contracts create mutual benefit for both the parties, so both supplier and the buyers? Because we've been looking at advantage from, each of them separately. Now, for both of them, is it by fostering long-term relationships? Oh, by simplifying and speeding up transactions, by providing bulk discounts, by ensuring fixed delivery. It's just they simplify things, okay, and speed up the transaction. That is the advantage that both parties will get from those deals. And which of the following is generally a benefit, okay? Which of the following is generally a benefit that a buyer enjoys when supplier uses a spot purchase contract to sell excess inventory? Now they're selling excess inventory and they want the money now. So that means it gives you some leverage. So negotiating lower prices for large orders. Okay, is that it? Is it receiving consistent supply chain services? Is it acquiring goods at a potentially discounted rate? Is it gaining fixed term supply? It is actually acquiring goods at a potentially discounted rates because these people are selling excess inventory and they want those things to move as fast as possible. Those are advantages. You still need to deal with disadvantages. Anyway, let's move on. Now, understanding the advantages associated with spot purchase contracts or spot purchasing from the supplier's perspective or even from the buyer's perspective is one thing. We get discounts, there is speed in delivery. Well, speed in the transaction, delivery is something else. Yeah, that's a good thing. But then there is a question of problems or risks associated with these particular contracts from both parties' point of view. So those are questions, there are questions that you need to understand that fall in that category. Because, so it's just, what is spot purchase, examples of spot purchase, where do you use them? Then we've talked about advantages. Now let's see, what are the questions that test your knowledge of, risk associated with those contracts? So in this case, number one, which of the following is a potential risk for buyers in spot purchase contract? Risk, buyers, okay? Is it limited product availability? Is that the risk? Is it higher price due to urgent needs? Is it locked in a long-term pricing? Okay. Is it complex contract terms? The thing is, because the buyer seems to be urgently in need of these things, the supplier is going to take an advantage and charge higher price so that they can maximize, and therefore higher price due to urgent needs. Sometimes that doesn't happen. You're just saying, given the options here, that is the one that seems to be, the one we go with. So how can spot purchases strain buyer-supplier relationship? Because by ensuring fixed price terms, by eliminating flexibility for the buyer or for buyers, by prioritizing immediate transaction over long-term collaboration, by reducing market competition. It's because these ones, they tend to be zero-sum. Okay? They are zero-sum. Somebody gains, somebody loses. So it's win-lose. I mean, you're not really negotiating. We just want the results. You're not interested in the relationship. Next, a supplier focuses solely on spot purchase during an economic boom, but struggles when demand drops. What risk does this pose? Overstocking, the overstock of finished goods, okay? Loss of cash flow during high demand period and predictable revenue stream, locked in contracts with the buyer. And the truth is, look, when there was that economic boom and then the demand drops, it means the revenue they're expecting, now they're not going to get it. So there is an unpredictability when it comes to these things, because you are making money now, but then later, which you don't know when that is going to be, suddenly you're not making money because, no one is buying that stuff. So that's the thing with the risks associated with those particular contracts. So now you know there's an advantage or benefits, and there are disadvantages, or in this case, risks, right? Those had to do with spot purchase. Remember, the idea here is understanding various types of commercial agreements between, obviously, the buyer and the seller. And so we've just talked about one, the spot purchase. Okay? So let's see, what's the other commercial agreement? Okay? And questions regarding that. I mean, if you have any question, you ask, obviously. Now, a term contract, okay, is the second one. And in this case, you're talking about contracts that have a definite start and a definite end. That is, they're running within a given term. That's the thing, term, okay? Like term 1, term 2, term 3. But in this case, they're starting today and they're ending. So basically any contract that has this contract starts today and then it ends on that day, that is a term contract. The parties to the contract agree that all the contract terms and conditions will apply between those two dates. That is the starting date and obviously the ending date. And term contracts are one of those solutions to problems or challenges that spot purchases tend to present. Like for example, you talked about as a disadvantage, you said spot purchases tend to put a strain in the buyer-supplier relationship by prioritizing results now and ignoring the collaboration, the advantages that could have been achieved had those two parties collaborated. So what are some of the questions that you need to find answers to here? To start us off, okay? To start us off, we're looking at questions like, so basically questions on the nature and typical use of term contracts. And so in this case, what is the primary feature of a term contract? It is valid for a single transaction? No. It has an indefinite duration? No, look. It establishes a fixed set of terms for a defined period. That's pretty much it. So that defined period there is what gives it that name, term, okay? Okay, we already pointed, Number 2, which of the following situation will a term contract be most appropriate? A one-time purchase of, see, that's a spot contract, okay? Spot purchase. Monthly procurement of cleaning supplies over a year. Purchasing a single custom-built machine. Hiring a consultant for a short-term project. Now, I mean, you could say, well, it's B, right? But then you might say, what about this one? Hiring a consultant, what is that? We don't know. Probably the consultant shows up for a day and then they go away, okay? Or if and when you need them. So that's more of a framework agreement then. So in this case, that is the best because over a fixed term, okay? And then they're supposed to supply every month. Now, number 3, a company uses a term contract to maintain its IT services for 3 years. What is the main benefit of this approach? It reduces upfront costs, predictable maintenance schedule and costs, okay? Freedom to switch vendors anytime, really, and you've just gotten, avoidance of long-term commitments. Well, 3 years, no, what do you mean by long-term commitment if you're already in a 3-year? The thing is, with these 3 years, it means you can predict the schedule and the cost because that contract will chart out all those things that are in that particular deal. Now, next one. Why are term contracts often preferred for raw material procurement in manufacturing? Okay, to ensure continuity of supply at predictable cost, to avoid managing supply. You're always going to be managing supply relationships, okay? To prevent overstocking, well, in that case, just go, to eliminate the need for quality checks. And the answer is to ensure continuity of supply at a predictable cost. This is just part of those things that you'll study later when you're talking about managing supply chain risks, okay? So there's that question that wants to test your knowledge on what is a term contract. Now let's move on. And in this case, let's look at advantages and disadvantages of such contracts from both the supplier and the buyer's perspective. Because, So in this case, we are looking at questions that deal with benefits of a term contract to both the purchaser and the supplier. So number 1, which of the following shows why a purchase? Okay, well, a purchaser. So there's spelling there. Which of the following shows why a purchaser may prefer a term contract? A, unlimited supply flexibility. Come on, really. B, frequent renegotiation of terms. You're going to be renegotiating, okay? Short-term engagement, not really. But predictable pricing for budgeting. That's the answer, right? Why are term contracts beneficial to suppliers when creating a production plan? Well, because they eliminate quality control requirements. No, they don't. Because they ensure a steady demand for products or services. Well, they require minimal documentation. They offer unrestricted pricing adjustments. Well, pricing adjustments in contracts sort of just depend on that particular contract and how you agreed. The thing is, they ensure a steady demand for product or services because it's not a one-off thing. You have a duration. That duration says you are going to be supplying these things based on how we agreed. Now, how does a term contract benefit the supplier in terms of cash flow? Well, they provide guaranteed payment for specific deliveries. And that's actually the thing because you just know within this term, this is how much money you're going to be making. Okay. These are the things like reducing the need for long-term customer relationship. It doesn't reduce anything. Eliminating risk of they can still pay you late, and that is why you have something called breach of a contract, or even increasing prices. Yeah, well, if the contract has an price adjustment clause, you can still increase the prices. The thing here is that they provide guaranteed payments for specific deliveries within that particular term. So there is that. But then there is also the risks and the disadvantages of a term contract. So what are these risks? Meaning what? In this case, which of the following shows a major risk for a buyer in a fixed term contract? So remember, we talked about advantages and now we're talking about disadvantages, right? So which of the following shows a major risk for a buyer in a term contract? Fixed pricing throughout the contract. No, we didn't say they are. Lack of flexibility in sourcing for other suppliers. That's pretty much the thing. You are locked into that contract for that particular time frame. So it's lack of flexibility. You can't really, then that makes it a breach of a contract unless the contract is over. Which of the following is a potential disadvantage for the supplier in a term contract? Guaranteed revenue over the contract period. How is that a disadvantage? Okay. Increased demand predictability. So it's actually reduced competition. Okay. No, it's not. Okay. I'm just, let me stop joking now. Okay. If you went for that, that's interesting. But the truth is, the requirement to absorb unexpected costs increase. That is, especially if you don't have a price adjustment. Because what you're saying is you got into this contract for this particular period. So you'll supply, you'll supply A between Jan to, March or something for X amount of money. So if the price goes up, that's a problem. We agreed on this particular price. But then there are ways around that. There are ways around dealing with the price issues. And you see those ones through things like price adjustment, okay? Depending on the sort of contract you have. Indexation and price adjustment formulas can help with those sort of issues, but you must have terms stating how the price is going to be adjusted and documentations to prove the need for that. But if none of that one is there, you just go into a contract saying supply this pen and each pen costs X and you want 50 or you want 1,000 and then suddenly the pen goes up by 1, then you see we had a deal, you incur that because otherwise if the price goes down you make more profit. Now that the price has gone up, just incur the loss, right? So that's a disadvantage to the supplier, especially if think of it this way, the longer the term contract, the larger the number of disadvantages that are going to be associated with that particular contract. So what have we done? We've talked about the benefits and the disadvantages, or benefits and risks of these contracts to both parties. If there is any question, you ask. All right, so let's move on. Framework agreements and panel agreements are another form of, or another type of commercial agreement that can exist between the buyer and the supplier, okay, or the purchaser and the supplier. Look, if we know that we're going to be using certain items, like we're going to be using these pens throughout a given period, right? And we don't want to be looking for suppliers every time we need these pens or these items, whatever items they are, right? But we also want the suppliers to be competitive. So here's what we can do. We can say we are compiling a list of suppliers that you're going to be sourcing from or you're going to be buying from, right? And so the suppliers are going to be bidding not to supply us with the pens that we need, but to be part of that list so that in future they can get us whatever we need. I mean, it's like, think of it this way. A company like Apple, right? They have a list of suppliers. Usually they put it online or something. I don't know if the recent one is up. But there's all these lists of suppliers that are going to be supplying them with microchips and whatever it is that it takes to make those particular mobile phones. So that list is what we call framework agreement or framework arrangement, depending on how formal or informal it is. Okay, so that's the thing that you're talking about here, or the questions that are going to be asked will revolve around that. A framework agreement is an overarching agreement or an umbrella agreement under which contracts can be created. So from the exam perspective, what sort of questions should you be expecting or should you anticipate, or rather, how will those questions look like? And so they could look something like this. And so in this case, what is the primary purpose of a framework agreement? Well, to create a legally binding commitment, no. To establish general terms and conditions for future purchases, to eliminate the need for competitive bidding, to transfer supply chain, risk to the buyer. Actually, is to establish general terms and conditions for future purchases, because as we said, they get into these, list, right? And then in future, we just do what we call call-offs. And then whichever supplier, you can have our own sort of competitive bidding and then, look, let's not complicate it. That's the thing. Number 2, a framework agreement with a single supplier is called, so what do we call that one? With a single supplier. So that's going to be 1-to-1, It's you and that particular supplier. Next, which of the following is an example of one-to-many framework agreements? Well, one-to-many, meaning there is one particular purchaser and many suppliers. So a retailer purchasing goods from multiple wholesalers, a government contracting multiple suppliers for IT services, multiple buyers, a group of suppliers, So the confusion is just between this one and this one. But then look, a retailer purchasing goods from multiple wholesalers, there is no framework agreement there. That is just somebody buying things from many people. It's government contracting multiple suppliers for IT services. Because remember, the whole idea behind a framework agreement is you get into this list. So this is one person, these are many. And then from there, they can start contracting you from the list. We don't see anything here suggesting the contract. Right, number 4. Which of the following scenarios represent many-to-one framework? So many buyers, one supplier. That is what we're talking about here. A consortium of companies using a simple supplier for services. All right, and we need to look further. So that's it. There is one. There are many buyers. So B, and one supplier. What is the advantage of one-to-one framework agreement? It reduces complexity in supplier management. Increases competition among, it's one, so there is no competition. Guaranteed cost, no. Eliminating risks nope. So it's, reduced complexity in supplier management because you're just dealing with one supplier. The first one is you, the second one is the suppliers. Or the first one is the buyer. Sometimes you're not the buyer. And then, Now, what type of framework agreement is best for ensuring competitive pricing? Because if you want people to compete, that's what you want. You want these suppliers to compete and give you the best price. So it means there has to be many on one side, on the side of the supplier, so that they can give you the best, the best deal. So that's one to many. Because many to many is just a lot of one-to-ones put together. So it's one-to-many, like one buyer, many suppliers, and then there's going to be a competitive bidding. And in that competitive bidding, they're going to be giving you the best price in that case. Now, a retail business enters into a framework agreement with a supplier for the supply of essential items, but they do not specify quantities upfront. What is the primary benefit for the retailer? When they do that? Well, they can purchase items at any time without renegotiating terms. So the prices will obviously, look, This is an example. This is an example of a framework agreement where the business says, we have a deal. So all of you guys are going to be supplying us things within this particular season. But we are not saying you're going to supply us 2, 3, 4, 5. We will tell you how many we need, but just know that you're going to be doing that. So that means you don't have to renegotiate every time we want those things. Okay? They lock in a fixed price for nope. The guaranteed fixed volume discount, not really. I mean, it's the ensure exclusivity. No, I mean, there could be other suppliers in that thing. So the thing is, they purchase items at any time. Well, it's not like any time, but there's going to be rules without renegotiating terms. Another one. In a competitive tender process, multiple suppliers are selected to enter into a framework agreement with the government department. What is the most likely reason for this approach? Whenever you just have multiple suppliers, usually the first reason is because you're just looking at cost. Okay, you want them to compete. And so the most likely reason in this case will be to guarantee suppliers to ensure that only the cheapest suppliers are selected. To eliminate the need for any future bidding. It's actually to foster competition. So to encourage competition among suppliers and drive down cost. That is the reason why you have many suppliers. Okay, that's the reason why you have many suppliers in that list, so that then the best emerges and then you use the best. Right, so that is framework agreement. But then we said framework agreement and panel agreements, right? So then the question becomes exactly what is that? And with panel agreement, what are we talking about? So a panel agreement is simply a framework agreement with more than one supplier. Okay, so one-to-many is an example of a panel agreement. So you have one buyer and a panel of suppliers. That's the idea there. And so the questions based on these, what sort of questions can you anticipate? I mean, it's still part of framework agreement, except in this case it's one-to-many. So the questions are going to look something like this. What is the primary purpose of a panel agreement in procurement? Is it to negotiate one-off contracts with suppliers? Is it to create pre-approved list of suppliers for future purchase? Is it to guarantee fixed prices for all future purchases, or to reduce the number of suppliers? Well, it's actually to create a pre-approved list. So a panel agreement, again I'll repeat, it's still a framework agreement, only that now you have several suppliers, right? Number 2, how are suppliers selected in a panel agreement? Well, they bid to get into that framework agreement. So is there anything that talks about that, or they compete to get into that framework agreement? So let's see. Through competitive bidding process or tender? I mean, that sort of says it, right? Directly negotiating? No. Choosing suppliers with the lowest? Nope, we don't even know. Based on suppliers' historical relationship with them? It's through competitive bidding process. So it's not different from, I mean, again, as I said, it's just a framework agreement, but in this case, there are several suppliers. So what is the typical benefit of using this panel agreement for the buyer? So what is the typical benefit of using a panel agreement for the buyer? Flexibility in choosing supplier for each order without renegotiating terms. A fixed quantity of goods is guaranteed? No. Only one supplier is chosen? Come on. It's framework, okay? It's panel. All suppliers are locked into long-term contracts with? No. Some of them may just decide not to compete when you do the call-off. So the answer is flexibility in choosing suppliers for each order without renegotiating the terms. So which of the following is not a characteristic of a panel agreement, or which isn't a trait? So they involve selection of suppliers from which the buyer can choose. Yes, they do. They set fixed prices for all future transactions. They outline general terms and conditions for future. Yes, they usually involve multiple suppliers in order to ensure competition. So they don't really set fixed prices. I mean, prices is a bit interesting. So depending on whatever you are dealing with, okay? It's not always the case that in your framework agreement you'll just have a fixed price. So no, you can have, what is it called? A ceiling and a floor price. Like it will range around here. Okay? Because if that thing is supposed to go for an entire year and it's January, so the supplier must be smart enough to know that if you agree on a fixed price in January, what if things go up in in, what is it called, in like October or November. Okay, we're in November, right? So all that. So those are some of the things that make it, the all fixed price thing doesn't make sense. Anyway, look. So now you know what a framework agreement is, and you also know that if you're dealing with several suppliers in a framework agreement, it becomes a panel agreement, and those relationships can be one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. Those are just types of framework agreements. Okay? Right. If there is any question you ask, let's move on. Okay, so now let's see. The whole point of these assessment criteria, okay, was for you to identify types of commercial agreements. All right. And we said we can have a spot purchase or a spot purchase contract where you just buy, one thing, one off, right? Which is urgent. We can have a term contract, which has a definite, which a contract that works within a definite period. It starts today, ends on this particular period, and that becomes the term. You can have a framework arrangement, or in this case, framework agreement. But then there is a fourth one, which is a call-off. Now, here's the thing, okay, with call-offs. So any framework agreement will only work when, here's how framework agreements work, right? You have the list, but then you're going to make a call-off. You're going to call, okay? You're going to tell the suppliers, this is what we need. And then that's how you end up with a call-off. So the framework agreement is not in itself a contract per se. It's more of an arrangement where suppliers are saying, yeah, if that person wants something, he or she is going to get those things from us. That's the agreement, okay? Or that's the arrangement. And so when they want those things, call-offs are going to be now taking place. So that is what a call-off is. So in this scenario, when talking about a call-off, what sort of questions can you be asked? And so let's talk about those particular questions. And basically in this case, we're just testing call-offs and their traits, okay? Now, number one, which of the following best describes a call-off in a procurement context? So a fixed quantity order for goods or service, a request for quotations from multiple suppliers. A request for quotation is basically RFQ rather, okay? RFI is request for information. A schedule of delivery requirements for a contract. Yeah, it's just that. That's a schedule of delivery. So a purchase order placed on an as-needed basis under framework agreement. So that is the call-off. Okay, so that's the thing. A call-off order is typically used in each of the following types of agreements. Again, that's some of these questions just test whether you know the practicality of these things. So you can say, is it in a single purchase contract? No. Is it in a framework agreement? Yes. Do we need to continue looking at the other answers? No. So framework agreement means you're going to use a call-off. Okay. Now, in a call-off agreement, the buyer has the right to make orders for a set period. Yeah. What is the maximum period for a call-off orders in most cases? 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. The truth is it will just depend on the contract terms, or specifically it will depend on the framework arrangement that you have in place. So the thing is, with call-off contracts, we know that, right? But then attached to, associated with the call-off, okay, call-offs is the idea of blanket orders or blanket ordering. Think of it this way. Let's say we have, we normally host parties, end of, like parties every month. Think of it that way, right? Like we have this thing where every month we have some sort of a lunch or something for our staff. So now we can have suppliers know that, okay, every month on this particular day, there's going to be an official lunch or an official dinner or a cocktails, one of those things on a monthly basis. So they just know that this entire year we are going to be doing this for this particular organization on these 12 times, because 12 months, on this particular day. So you see, that is a regular order. Okay? So it's a blanket order because it covers the entire year, but it's regular. But then it can also be irregular because you're just saying, yes, we are going to have luncheons, okay, 6 times in a year. we'll let you know when those ones are. So the thing will be, we need to agree on how much of notice you need to give us before those things happen. So anyway, questions covering this sort of thing will be, they look like this, okay? Those questions are going to be something like this. So in this case, we're talking about questioning, testing your knowledge of blanket orders. And what is a blanket order in procurement? Well, it is a single purchase order for a specific quality of goods. And it's a long-term agreement to purchase goods or service from a supplier over a set period. Contract that specify fixed prices, a request for no. It's just a long-term, as we said it. Okay, a long-term agreement to purchase goods or service from a supplier over a set period. Now it can be regular, it can be irregular. In blanket order, who typically controls the quantity and timing of delivery? That's going to be the buyer. Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. So it's the buyer. Okay. I don't know what you chose. What did you choose? So, third question. A company enters into a blanket order with a supplier for office supplies to be delivered throughout the year. What would likely be included in terms of the agreement? Specific payment terms for each delivery, exact delivery dates for each order, a fixed percentage discount over a year, total volume of office supplies, and price per unit, because we are saying we are going to deliver office throughout the year. So we just need to know how many of these office supplies are you going to need, price per unit. So now that we know the volume, the question of when you'll require them will depend. Is it a regular or an irregular order? Look, the whole point here was just for you to be in a position to identify the types of commercial agreements, okay, between, in this case, the purchaser and the supplier. And that meant, first of all, you need to understand what exactly is a contract, an agreement, how does an agreement differ from a contract, and things of that nature. And then spot purchase, a term contract, framework agreement, and a call-off. So those are the things that we looked at in these particular assessment criteria of level 3, module 3, that is contract administration. Okay? If there is any question you ask, remember these are revision series, okay? So if you're interested in like those lecture notes and whatever, just let me know. See you in the next video.